Hey guys, tonight we're sailing down the Nile to meet one of the most famous, most misunderstood and frankly most exhausting women in all of recorded history, Cleopatra. Not the Hollywood version, not the Elizabeth Taylor version with the eyeliner and the dramatic fainting. The real one. The one who ran a superpower while learning 9 languages, charming 2 of the most powerful men on earth, and somehow still finding time to micromanage Egypt's grain supply. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a truly heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and so does Egypt. Seriously, your suggestions are what shape this channel, and every time one of you drops a comment with an idea, I read it. It means more than you know. And speaking of which, we are now on Spotify. Link in the description if you'd rather drift off to this in your earbuds, like the historically curious person you clearly are. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan, pull your blanket up, and let's ease in together. But first, have you ever wondered what it actually took to be Cleopatra? Did she really bathe in donkey milk, or is that just something people say to feel better about their own skincare routines? What did she eat for breakfast, and did someone taste it first in case it was poisoned? Did she wake up looking like that, or was there an entire team of people responsible? How do you run an empire, seduce Julius Caesar, and also somehow find time to read philosophy before noon? Could you survive a single day in her royal sandals? The politics, the perfume, the pressure, the very real possibility that someone in your own palace is actively plotting your death while also trying to borrow your eye pencil? And now, congratulations, you have just woken up in 49 BCE. You're Cleopatra VII Philopator, Queen of Egypt, goddess on earth, and ruler of the most ancient civilization in the known world. Your hair is already perfect. Somehow. Everything else is significantly more complicated. Good luck. Cleopatra did not arrive into a stable, golden Egypt. She arrived into a dynasty on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Born in 69 BCE, she was the 3rd child of Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, which translates roughly to the flute player, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously Rome took her father. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. The first planted his flag and declared himself pharaoh, but by Cleopatra's childhood, the kingdom was hemorrhaging power, drowning in debt to Rome, and held together mostly by tradition, stubbornness, and denial. Her father had literally paid the Roman Senate an enormous bribe just to be officially recognized as a legitimate king, which is a little like paying someone to confirm you own your own house. She watched all of this from the palace in Alexandria, and she took notes. The Ptolemaic court was extraordinary in its contradictions. On the surface, it was one of the most sophisticated royal households in the world, all marble corridors and perfumed air and scholarship and ceremonial grandeur. Beneath that surface, it was a long-running family disaster where siblings plotted against siblings, advisors played factions off each other, and everyone with a title was at least theoretically a target. 2 of Cleopatra's own sisters would eventually be executed, one by their father, one by Cleopatra herself. This is the household in which she learned what power actually looked like up close, which was nothing like the statue suggested. Egypt itself, meanwhile, was being slowly digested by Rome. Not through outright conquest, not yet, but through debt, dependency, and the creeping realization that the most powerful force in the Mediterranean had decided Egypt was too valuable to leave alone. Rome's appetite for Egyptian grain was insatiable. Roman bankers had their hands in Ptolemaic finances. Roman generals passed through Alexandria with their armies and their opinions. The kingdom was still technically independent, but it was the kind of independence that requires constant, exhausting maintenance. the way you might describe still technically owning a house that the bank has a very strong interest in. Ptolemy XII spent much of his reign attempting to keep Rome happy enough to leave Egypt alone, which required money he didn't always have, and diplomatic skills that his nickname, again, the flute player, did not particularly suggest. When the Romans annexed Cyprus, which was ruled by Cleopatra's uncle, Ptolemy XII did nothing. The Egyptian public was furious. He fled to Rome to negotiate and was driven out of Alexandria in his absence, replaced temporarily by his daughter, Berenice IV. When he returned, backed by Roman soldiers, he had Berenice executed. Family dynamics in the palace were not subtle. Cleopatra grew up watching all of this. She watched her father grovel. She watched her sister die. She watched Egypt bend and contort to survive, and she drew conclusions that would define everything she did afterward. That intelligence was more durable than military force, that Rome could be managed if you understood it, and that the single most important thing she could do for Egypt was to make herself indispensable to whoever was currently winning. She was not going to be the flute player. She was not going to pay tribute for recognition of her own legitimacy. She was going to be something her father was not, a ruler Rome actually needed. She just has to survive long enough to become her. Now here is something that tends to get buried beneath all the snake imagery and romantic mythology. Cleopatra was, by almost any measure, one of the most educated people alive in the ancient world. She was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in nearly 3 centuries to bother learning Egyptian. Her predecessors had ruled Egypt for generations without ever speaking to their own subjects in their own language, which is a bold governance strategy if nothing else. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages: Egyptian, Greek, Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, the Median tongue, Parthian, and Latin. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and rhetoric, and she spent significant time in the great Library of Alexandria, which at the time housed the largest collection of written knowledge in the world. Well, this was not a woman who sat in a palace waiting to be interesting. She was relentlessly, almost aggressively, building herself into something unstoppable. Her education began early, as it did for all Ptolemaic royal children. Tutors arrived before breakfast, and the curriculum was serious. Greek was her first language, the tongue of the dynasty and of the scholarly world. Philosophy, mathematics, and rhetoric were the core of a classical education, and she absorbed them. But Cleopatra did not stop at the classical curriculum. She pushed into languages that had no political prestige, no social requirement, no practical demand on a Greek-speaking queen. Egyptian was one of them. She learned to speak it, to read the hieroglyphic script, and to read the demotic, the everyday written form. At a time when most of her family treated Egyptian priests as useful props in a ceremony, rather than actual people worth addressing directly. Think about what that means for a moment. She chose to do more work. She chose to learn harder things. In an age when being born into a palace was considered sufficient qualification for most things, Cleopatra decided that qualification was not enough. She wanted to actually understand the country she was supposed to rule. This is the kind of decision that sounds obvious in retrospect and is inexplicably rare in practice. Like a manager who actually learns how the product works, except the product is a civilization, and the stakes are significantly higher. The Library of Alexandria was a resource she used constantly. Ancient accounts describe her engaging directly with scholars, asking questions, commissioning research, debating interpretations of older texts. She was not browsing, she was working. She had a particular interest in medicine and natural philosophy, and she was later credited in the ancient world with written works on cosmetics, medicine, and alchemy, texts attributed to her that circulated for centuries after her death. Whether she wrote them entirely herself or oversaw their compilation is debated. What is not debated is that her name was attached to them, which meant she was considered knowledgeable enough to be credible. Her grasp of languages was also a form of intelligence gathering. When an ambassador spoke to her in his native tongue and she replied fluently, something shifted in the room. She was not the figurehead being briefed by translators. She heard everything directly. She caught the hesitation, the subtext, the word chosen over another word. Translators, after all, make choices, and Cleopatra had no interest in anyone making linguistic choices on her behalf. By the time she came to the throne, she was arguably the best prepared ruler in the Eastern Mediterranean, overqualified for a job that would have broken most people anyway. She had done everything right in preparation. The chaos waiting for her was simply that thorough. The palace complex at Alexandria was not simply a building. It was an entire city within a city, sprawling across a peninsula on the Mediterranean coast, filled with temples, gardens, audience halls, private quarters, harbours, and more rooms than any sensible person could keep track of. It gleamed with marble and limestone. Fountains ran. Gardens were tended by small armies of staff, the Bruchaion. The royal quarter was renowned as one of the most spectacular architectural complexes in the ancient world. Living there was an experience of almost absurd opulence and also almost absurd danger. The court was packed with advisors, priests, courtiers, family members with ambitions, servants who heard everything, guards who answered to someone other than you, and siblings who might, at any moment, decide they'd quite like to be pharaoh instead. The palace was a marvel. It was also a maze of loyalties, and Cleopatra had to navigate every single corridor of it. The harbour view from the royal quarters was extraordinary. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, rose to roughly 350 feet on a small island just offshore, one of the tallest structures in the world and the brightest navigational beacon in the ancient Mediterranean. Ships from Greece, Rome, Syria, Arabia, and beyond moved through the harbour constantly. Alexandria was the most important trading port in the known world, and the palace sat at the top of it all, watching everything arrive and leave. The view was both beautiful and informational. You could read the health of the kingdom from the harbour traffic. Inside, the palace functioned on ceremony to a degree that modern open-plan offices would find unrecognisable. Every movement through the public spaces had choreography: who walked where, who stood when, who spoke first, who could look directly at the Queen, and who had to avert their eyes. This was not mere decorative ritual. It was a system of visual communication, constantly broadcasting the hierarchy of power to everyone who entered. Disruptions to the ceremony were not trivial social awkwardness. They were political statements. The court was also a listening post. Every servant, every attendant, every scribe who copied documents, and every guard who stood in a corridor had eyes and ears. And in a court this size, information moved through informal channels faster than any official dispatch. Cleopatra would have known this from childhood, that the palace walls had their own memory, that nothing said within them was truly private, and that managing her own information as carefully as she managed the kingdom's was a survival requirement, not an optional extra. And then there was the smell. Ancient sources and archaeological chemistry suggest that the royal quarters of Ptolemaic palaces were heavily perfumed. Kyphi burned in censers, floral garlands changed daily, scented oils applied to fabrics and floors. The sensory experience of the palace was itself a form of power projection. You arrived in the presence of the Queen, and the environment told you through every sense available that you were somewhere categorically different from everywhere else. It was deliberate, it was managed, it worked. The palace was where Cleopatra slept, ate, worked, received diplomats, performed religious ceremonies, raised her children, and plotted her political survival. It was her home, her office, and her stage, all at once, always simultaneously. Comfortable, yes, in ways that most of the ancient world could not have imagined, but never, not for a single day of her reign, entirely safe. You did not simply wake up as Cleopatra. You were woken. By the time her eyes opened each morning, there were already people in the room, attendants who had been waiting, silently, for the precise moment of royal consciousness, the way a very anxious and overdressed alarm clock might. The morning ritual was elaborate, codified, and deeply serious, because Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was officially a goddess, the earthly embodiment of Isis, and goddesses do not shuffle blearily to the kitchen in old socks. Every morning began with ritual purification, the washing of hands and face with water that had been ceremonially prepared, the burning of incense, and prayers offered to the gods before the business of being divine could officially begin. The scent in the royal chambers was extraordinary. Myrrh, kyphi, lotus, layers of fragrance so deliberately composed that even the air in the palace was considered part of the royal presentation. After purification came the physical preparations, and this is where the team arrived. Multiple attendants, each with a specific function, moved through the morning with practiced efficiency. One managed the linens, folding away the night's bedding and preparing the day's garments. One was responsible for the hair, which in Cleopatra's case was a significant undertaking, elaborate braided and pinned styles, often augmented with extensions of human hair or fibre, adorned with gold pins, beaded ornaments, and in formal contexts the full royal headdress. There were attendants for the application of oils to the skin, for the preparation of the day's cosmetics, for the dressing. It was essentially a production. The question you are probably asking, which is very reasonable, is whether this felt suffocating, whether being surrounded by attendants from the moment you opened your eyes was something you could get used to, or whether there was ever a moment when you simply wanted to pour your own cup of water and sit quietly for 5 minutes. The honest answer, based on what we know about Cleopatra's character, is that she probably found privacy in public ways that most of us would not recognise as privacy. Ancient accounts suggest she was always reading, scrolls, reports, correspondence, and that her mornings included time with documents before any official audiences began. The attendants were background, the scrolls were her solitude, and breakfast happened in this context, food brought in, tasted first, presented, and then came the briefings. Egypt was a country that ran on information, the level of the Nile, the progress of the harvest, the state of the grain stores, the movements of ships in the harbour, the latest dispatches from Rome. Cleopatra's mornings were not gentle transitions into the day, they were operational. By the time she appeared in any public or ceremonial capacity, she had already processed significant amounts of information and made decisions about how the day would be navigated. The transformation into the goddess Isis, the formal, ceremonial version of herself that appeared before priests, foreign dignitaries, and her own people, was the final stage of the morning. The robes, the headdress, the coal, the jewels. It took time, it took a team. And when it was complete, you did not see Cleopatra getting dressed. You saw the goddess stepping forward. That was the point. The woman and the deity were the same person, and the morning ritual was the machinery that made the transition seamless. It was theatre with real consequences, performed every single day without exception for 21 years of rule. Let's talk about the famous eyes, because they were not an accident, and they were not just decorative. Cleopatra's iconic coal-rimmed gaze was the product of a daily ritual that was equal parts vanity, science, and spiritual protection. Coal, ground from galena, malachite, or antimony, was applied in thick lines extending to the temples, a style that had been standard in Egypt for thousands of years, But here is the thing modern historians find genuinely fascinating. The compounds in ancient Egyptian eye paint, particularly lead-based ones, may have actually helped prevent eye infections in the damp, insect-heavy Nile environment. So the most famous eye makeup in history was also functioning medicine. Your skincare routine in 2024 probably does not double as infection prevention, but to be fair, you also do not live next to the Nile Delta, so. Cleopatra reportedly had teams of cosmetic specialists, formulators essentially, who prepared her cosmetics fresh each day. These were not cosmetics purchased from a shelf. They were mixed to order, in the palace, by people who understood the specific properties of every ingredient. Ancient texts and remnants of cosmetic containers found in archaeological digs suggest these preparations included ground minerals, plant extracts, animal fats, and aromatic resins. Copper-based malachite was used for a green eye paint applied to the lower lids. Red ochre was used on the lips and cheeks. Ground coal went on the upper lids in the distinctive elongated style that has been copied, with varying levels of success, for roughly 2,000 years of artistic and cosmetic history. The hair preparations were equally serious. Oils of moringa, extracted from the seeds of the moringa tree and prized in ancient Egypt for its purity and its resistance to rancidity, were used to condition and scent the hair. Castor oil, one of Egypt's major agricultural products, was used both medicinally and cosmetically. Henna was used on hair, hands, and nails. The royal body oil preparations combined fragrant resins and plant extracts with base oils in formulations that were specific to the palace and considered part of the royal presentation. None of this was superficial in the ancient Egyptian sense. Beauty rituals were a religious practice. To be clean, oiled, painted, and perfumed was to be in a state of ritual purity, appropriate for someone who was also, formally, a goddess. The cosmetics were offerings to divinity as much as they were personal preparation. The line between hygiene, beauty, and worship was not a line at all. It was a continuous practice that wove all three together seamlessly. What is interesting, and slightly humbling, is how sophisticated the chemistry behind all of this actually was. Ancient Egyptians had been refining cosmetic preparation for thousands of years before Cleopatra was born. By her time, the knowledge was deep. The moringa-based oils do not go rancid. The lead compounds in some coal preparations do generate nitric oxide, which has antimicrobial properties. The formulations were not guesswork. They were the accumulated practical science of a civilization that had been paying very close attention for a very long time. The eyeliner was extraordinary. The eyeliner was also doing something useful. That is honestly a fairly elegant achievement. The ancient sources claim she bathed in the milk of 700 donkeys. 700. Now, before you start running calculations about how many donkeys that requires and what the logistics might have looked like, the feeding, the housing, the milking schedule, the sheer organizational infrastructure of a 700 donkey bathing operation inside a royal palace, let's sit with that number for a moment, because whoever wrote it down clearly wanted you to be impressed and also slightly alarmed. Whether this was literal, exaggerated, or pure propaganda aimed at either glorifying or mocking her is still debated by historians who have spent considerably more time thinking about donkeys than they probably anticipated when they chose their field of study. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. There is chemical basis for it. Donkey milk is remarkably similar in composition to human milk and contains lactic acid, vitamins A, B, C, D, and E, and proteins that do in fact soften and improve the appearance of skin. Lactic acid is an alpha-hydroxy acid, the kind that modern skincare brands charge significant amounts of money to include in products. The Romans who wrote about Cleopatra's donkey milk baths were not entirely fabricating. Whether she used 700 donkeys' worth or significantly less, the practice was not irrational. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely advanced skincare. More broadly, Cleopatra's skin preparations were the product of Egyptian cosmetic tradition that stretched back thousands of years. Oils of moringa and sesame were the primary moisturizers, moringa oil being particularly prized because of its purity and its extraordinary shelf stability, the ancient equivalent of a product that does not go off. Beeswax appeared in preparations for the lips. Natron, the mineral salt used in Egyptian embalming, also featured in cleansing preparations, yet functioning as a mild abrasive and antiseptic. Dead sea salts were used in exfoliating treatments. The ingredients list in modern terms reads like a very curated natural beauty brand. The ritual of bathing itself, regardless of what it was done in, was also a formal undertaking. Bathing in the ancient Egyptian royal context involved a sequence of preparations: cleansing, oiling, scenting, and finally the application of cosmetics. It was not a quick shower. It was a ceremony attended by multiple servants, conducted in purpose-built bathing facilities within the palace complex. The temperature, the sequence, the specific preparations, all of it was deliberate. What Cleopatra's skincare tells us practically is that she existed in a culture that took the maintenance of the royal body with absolute seriousness. Not out of vanity in the modern sense, but because the queen's body was also the goddess's body, and the goddess had to be properly maintained. The spiritual and the cosmetic were not separate categories. Bathing in something extraordinary was not indulgence. It was, in the logic of the ancient world, entirely appropriate. 700 donkeys or not, the woman clearly had a routine. And the routine, as routines go, was not unreasonable. Food in Cleopatra's court was extraordinary by any standard of the ancient world, but eating it came with an asterisk. No meal of any significance was served to the queen without first passing through a taster, a person whose entire professional function was to eat the food before Cleopatra did, and then wait a few minutes to see if anything terrible happened. This was not a ceremonial role. This was a person who understood exactly what their job description entailed and showed up anyway, which says something remarkable about the ancient employment market. Assuming the taster survived breakfast, which most mornings they did, Cleopatra's table would have included breads and flatbreads made from emmer wheat, an array of vegetables including leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce, and cucumbers, fresh and dried fruits such as figs, dates, pomegranates, and grapes, and dishes prepared with fish from the Nile and the Mediterranean. The bread was important in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. Egyptian bread was the foundation of the entire diet, from the poorest farmer to the royal table. The difference at the royal level was quality. Finely milled wheat rather than coarser grain, shaped into elaborate forms, sometimes enriched with honey, oil, or spices. Ancient bakeries excavated near royal sites show an astonishing variety of bread shapes and formulations. It was not bread the way we experience it now, thick sliced from a plastic bag. It was bread as craft, as gift, as daily ceremonial offering. Meat appeared on the royal table in ways it did not for most Egyptians. Beef, duck, goose, and various game birds were available. Fish was consumed in great variety. The Nile and the Mediterranean between them offered an enormous range of species, many of which were dried, salted, or prepared in sauces. Ancient Egyptian fish sauce, not entirely unlike the Roman garum that Julius Caesar's kitchen would have considered a staple, appeared as a condiment and ingredient. The flavours of the royal table were complex, sweet, salty, sharp, and herbed, layered in the way that a cuisine built on thousands of years of agricultural refinement tends to be. Wine was served, diluted with water in the Greek tradition. Egyptian wine from the Delta vineyards was considered perfectly respectable, and imported wines from Greece and other regions were also available. Beer, thicker and less refined than the modern variety, was a daily beverage for most Egyptians, including within the palace for lower-ranking staff, but at the royal table wine was the preferred choice for formal occasions. The entire meal, from preparation to presentation, was managed by a hierarchy of kitchen staff, bakers, cooks, sauce makers, and the serving attendants who carried everything to the table. The food arrived on gold and silver vessels that were themselves part of the display of royal wealth. Ancient accounts of Ptolemaic banquets describe tables of spectacular abundance. Food as spectacle, as political statement, as demonstration of what Egypt could produce and afford. Cleopatra presided over all of this with the taster in front of her, the advisers around her, and a stack of morning reports somewhere to her left. It was breakfast. It was also a meeting. In the palace, they were generally the same thing. The 9 languages were not a party trick. They were operational tools in a court that was genuinely multinational, and Cleopatra used them the way a modern diplomat uses a briefing document. Constantly, strategically, and always with awareness of what the other person in the room was not saying. Alexandria was cosmopolitan in a way that most ancient cities were not. Greek was the language of the court and scholarship, Egyptian the language of the priests and common people, Aramaic the trade tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean, Hebrew and Arabic the languages of important neighbouring communities. When Cleopatra spoke to an Egyptian priest in his own language for the first time, the political effect was immediate and enormous. When she addressed her son's tutors in flawless Greek and then pivoted to Latin, with Roman envoys without pausing, the signal was clear: you are not dealing with a figurehead. Consider what a diplomatic audience with Cleopatra actually looked like in practice. An envoy would arrive from, say, the Judean court, a region whose cooperation was strategically essential to Egypt's northeastern border stability. Either the envoy spoke Aramaic and perhaps some Greek. Most rulers of this period would have conducted the meeting through interpreters, a translated question, a translated answer, a conversation conducted in 4-second delays through someone else's comprehension. Cleopatra spoke to him in Aramaic, directly, without an interpreter present. The ambassador, accustomed to being filtered through translators, accustomed to the slight distance that creates, would have experienced something that was not simply impressive. It was disarming. You cannot guard yourself quite as carefully when you suddenly realize the other person is hearing everything you say in the exact words you chose to say it. For the Egyptian population and priesthood, her use of their language was even more profound. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for roughly 300 years at this point. In all that time, no Ptolemaic ruler had bothered to learn Egyptian. The priests conducted ceremonies in their ancient language, administered the temples in their ancient script, and managed the relationship between the state and the divine in a linguistic world that the Greek royal family simply did not enter. Cleopatra entered it. When she appeared at temple ceremonies and addressed the priests in Egyptian, performing the rituals in the correct language with the correct honorifics, she was not simply being polite. She was telling the entire religious establishment of Egypt that she was different, that she had chosen, deliberately and with effort, to meet them on their ground. Latin, her 9th language and almost certainly the last she acquired, was the language of the future. By the mid-1st century BCE, it was becoming clear that any realistic calculation of Egypt's long-term independence had to account for Rome in a fundamental way. Latin was not yet the dominant language of diplomacy. Greek still held that position in the Eastern Mediterranean, but Caesar and the Romans who came after him were Latin speakers in their private conversations, their internal correspondence, their moments of unguarded candour. Cleopatra spoke to them in Latin when she chose to. Not always. Greek was often the preferred mutual ground, but the option was there. She had the ability to be in the room, linguistically, for every conversation. That ability is not nothing. In the ancient world of competing powers and constant manoeuvring, it was probably everything. There was a version of Cleopatra's job that gets almost no screen time in any film about her, and it is perhaps the most genuinely impressive part of her reign. She was an administrator of staggering competence who managed one of the most complex economies in the ancient world. Egypt in the 1st century BCE was an enormous and intricate operation. The agricultural system of the Nile Valley, the most productive in the ancient world, ran on a bureaucracy of tax collectors, scribes, engineers and overseers who managed the annual inundation cycle, calculated crop yields, organized grain storage, and kept records of every field, every harvest, and every farmer. Cleopatra was at the top of all of this. She received reports, issued edicts, managed grain distribution both internally and for export, controlled the papyrus trade, and oversaw the collection of taxes in a system so thorough that virtually every transaction in Egypt was tracked in some way. The Nile was the engine of everything. Each year, the annual flood deposited fresh silt across the agricultural land of the valley, a natural fertilization cycle that made Egyptian soil the most productive on earth. Managing that cycle, predicting its extent, and organizing the agricultural response to it was the foundational task of Egyptian governance. Nilometers, structures built at key points along the river to measure the flood level, provided the data that the entire system ran on. A low flood meant insufficient irrigation, reduced harvests, and the threat of famine. A high flood meant potential damage to infrastructure and villages. The ideal flood level was known precisely, and the gap between ideal and actual was calculated within days of the inundation beginning. Cleopatra received those numbers. She made decisions based on them. The grain trade was Egypt's primary economic relationship with the rest of the Mediterranean world, and Cleopatra managed it with close attention. Egyptian grain fed Rome in significant quantities. The state control of the grain supply, which Egypt maintained rigidly, unlike most ancient economies, meant that the queen personally controlled something that the Roman world needed. This was leverage, and she understood it as such. The price of grain, the quantities exported, the timing of shipments, these were instruments of foreign policy as much as commercial decisions. Beyond grain, Egypt controlled the papyrus trade. Papyrus, the writing material that the ancient world ran on, grew almost exclusively in the Nile Delta, and its production was a royal monopoly. Every scroll in the Library of Alexandria, every administrative document in Rome, every letter and contract and legal instrument in the Eastern Mediterranean was written on Egyptian papyrus. Cleopatra owned that supply chain. The linen trade, the glass trade, the production of natron used in embalming and industry across the region, all of it ran through the royal administration in one form or another. She also managed a workforce that, by ancient standards, was enormous. The construction and maintenance of temples, which were not just religious sites but also economic centres, employing craftsmen, farmers and traders, fell under royal supervision. The management of the hundreds of thousands of people who worked in Egyptian agriculture, manufacture, and trade required a bureaucratic apparatus of considerable sophistication. Cleopatra did not micromanage each individual transaction, but she set the policy, she reviewed the summaries, and she made the calls when the summaries required one. She was, in modern terms, a chief executive of a medium-sized economy. The fact that she was also a living goddess and a global political celebrity was, practically speaking, a secondary complication. One of the more unusual items on Cleopatra's daily schedule by modern standards was the routine maintenance of her divine identity. She was the living embodiment of Isis, goddess of motherhood, magic, healing, and the annual flooding of the Nile, and this was not a metaphor. It was official theology. Her subjects believed it, her priests enforced it, her coins depicted it, and Cleopatra herself played the role with complete conviction, because she understood with crystalline clarity that the goddess was not separate from the queen. The goddess was the queen's greatest political asset. Isis was beloved across Egypt and increasingly across the Mediterranean world. When Cleopatra, dressed in the robes of Isis, wore the characteristic headdress with the sun disk and cow horns, and appeared at temple ceremonies to perform ritual offerings, she was not playing dress-up. She was conducting statecraft in the only language that reached every level of Egyptian society simultaneously, the language of divine legitimacy. The identification with Isis was not new to Cleopatra. Ptolemaic queens had been associated with the goddess for generations, but Cleopatra pursued it with a thoroughness and personal conviction that exceeded her predecessors. She learned the religious texts. She performed the rituals in Egyptian. She made offerings at temples up and down the Nile with a visibility and consistency that her ancestors had not maintained. She was seen to be Isis, not simply entitled to the title. The difference mattered to her subjects in a way that is difficult to fully translate into modern terms, but might be loosely compared to the difference between a leader who performs the gestures of a role and one who inhabits it so completely that the gesture and the person are indistinguishable. Isis herself was a profoundly versatile goddess in the Egyptian religious tradition. She was the devoted wife who reassembled her murdered husband Osiris and restored him to life. She was the fierce protective mother who shielded her son Horus from those who sought to destroy him. She was the goddess of magic, of healing, of all the arts that preserved and renewed life. For a ruling queen with a son whose legitimacy was politically contested, whose father figure had been murdered by his enemies, and who was engaged in a permanent defensive campaign against forces that wanted her removed, the resonance of that mythology was not coincidental. Cleopatra was not just borrowing the goddess's image. She was living the goddess's story. She knew it, and she made sure her subjects knew it too. The cult of Isis had also spread beyond Egypt by this point, establishing temples and devotees across the Mediterranean world, in Greece, in Rome, along the trade routes of the Eastern Sea. When Cleopatra presented herself to foreign visitors as Isis incarnate, she was invoking a figure they already had emotional and religious associations with. The goddess spoke across borders in ways that the Ptolemaic political brand did not. It was, in a sense, her most transferable credential, recognized from Rome to Arabia, from the Aegean to the Red Sea coast. Being a queen was local, being a goddess was universal. Cleopatra understood the difference, and she used it every single day. The great Library of Alexandria sat at the edge of the royal quarter, close enough that Cleopatra could, and apparently did, walk there. It was the single greatest repository of written knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. At its height, it may have contained somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient source you believe and how generous you're feeling. It was not simply a library in the modern sense of a building where you return things late and pay small fines. It was a research institution, a university, a philosophical hub. The greatest scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers of the age worked there. Euclid had laid out his geometry there. Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the earth there. Archimedes had studied there. For Cleopatra, it was both a practical resource and a philosophical home. The library's collection had been assembled through a deliberate and occasionally aggressive acquisition policy. Ptolemy III, one of Cleopatra's predecessors, reportedly ordered that all ships entering Alexandria's harbour be searched for books, which would then be copied. The originals kept by the library and copies returned to their owners. Whether the copies were always quite as carefully produced as promised is, historically speaking, a matter of some scepticism. The library also purchased collections, commissioned translations, and employed scholars specifically to produce new texts. It was an active intellectual institution, not a passive archive. Walking into the library meant entering a world organised by subject, scrolls stored in specific sections, catalogued in a system credited to Callimachus of Cyrene, the ancient world's most impressive attempt at systematic bibliographic organization. The Pinnaces, the catalogue, ran to 120 volumes of its own. Finding what you needed in the library required knowledge of the system, which meant that scholarly access was, in practice, mediated by the scholars who worked there and knew it well. Cleopatra's relationship with those scholars was not the relationship of a patron who funds work she does not understand. She was a participant in the intellectual life of the institution. The subjects she engaged with most directly were practical as well as philosophical. Medicine interested her. Ancient sources credit her with pharmacological and medical writings, and the library's medical collection would have been an obvious resource. Astronomy was directly relevant to Egyptian agricultural planning, since the calendar, the prediction of the Nile inundation, and the religious festival schedule all depended on celestial observation. Philosophy, particularly the Stoic and Epicurean schools that dominated educated Mediterranean thought in this period, provided the intellectual framework within which political ethics, governance, and the nature of power were debated. The library was also, practically speaking, an intelligence resource. It contained geographical texts, accounts of foreign peoples and their customs, histories of neighbouring kingdoms, and records of past diplomatic arrangements. A ruler who read those texts had context that a ruler who did not read them simply lacked. Cleopatra had context. She went to the library regularly, engaged with its scholars, and left with more information than she arrived with. In a world where knowing things was one of the primary currencies of power, that habit was worth as much as any army. Any family can be complicated. A royal Ptolemaic family was complicated in ways that require a flowchart, a therapist, and possibly a food taster just to get through the dinner table. Cleopatra had siblings, 2 younger sisters, Arsinoe IV and Berenice IV, and 2 younger brothers, both named Ptolemy, because the Ptolemies were running out of ideas by that point, and nearly all of them wanted to be pharaoh. Berenice IV had already seized the throne once while their father, Ptolemy XII, was away in Rome begging for political support, and their father had dealt with that upon his return in a manner that was final and not particularly warm. By the time Cleopatra came to power in 51 BCE at the age of 18, following her father's death, she was co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was perhaps 10 years old and already surrounded by advisors who were very interested in running things themselves. The co-rulership arrangement was standard Ptolemaic practice. The heir was expected to rule alongside a sibling of the opposite sex, and in theory it was a governance structure. In practice, it was a ticking clock. The history of the Ptolemaic dynasty is littered with co-rulerships that ended badly for one of the parties involved, and everyone in the palace knew this history because they had all grown up inside it. Cleopatra knew that her brother's advisors, a trio of men named Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus, none of whom had any interest in a capable, strong-willed queen having actual authority, were working to reduce her influence from the beginning of the reign. The dynamic was familiar to anyone who's ever watched a determined person try to do their job while a committee of people without their competence works methodically to undermine them. Except in this case, the committee had an army, and the stakes were survival rather than a performance review. Cleopatra was 18, newly crowned, and immediately in a political contest with men who had spent years building their position in the court, and who viewed her intelligence as a threat rather than a resource. Her sister Arsinoe was a different kind of problem, not a pawn of advisors, but an ambitious player in her own right, young but perceptive and genuinely capable. The relationship between the two sisters was never simple. They would eventually end up on opposite sides of a military conflict. Arsinoe would be paraded through Rome as a prisoner, spared by Caesar, sent to exile, and eventually, years later, executed on Cleopatra's orders, What this tells you about Cleopatra is the same thing it tells you about every ruler who's ever had to deal with a brilliant sibling with a competing claim, that family and politics, in a royal context, are not separate categories, and compassion for one cannot be allowed to create vulnerabilities in the other. It is a cold calculation. Cleopatra made it without apparent hesitation, which is either ruthless or simply rational, depending on where you're standing and whether you are the sibling in question. One of the stranger facts about Cleopatra's life is that she was, at a certain point, forced out of her own country by her own younger brother, or rather, was by the council of advisors who were using her brother like a royal sock puppet. In 49 BCE, after roughly 2 years of co-rule with Ptolemy XIII, the power struggle that had been simmering since their father's death finally boiled over. Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria and out of Egypt entirely. She regrouped in Syria, doing the thing that only genuinely determined people do in that situation. She raised an army. She gathered troops, resources, and allies along the eastern border, and she positioned herself at Pelusium on the northeastern edge of Egypt, preparing to take back what was hers. She was 20 years old. She'd been exiled from the country she was born to rule, she had no powerful patron, and the Mediterranean world was simultaneously being consumed by a Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Most people in that situation would consider new options. Cleopatra considered tactics. The exile lasted roughly a year, and it is one of the most revealing periods of her character. Stripped of the palace, the court, the ceremonial structures that amplified her authority, she demonstrated that the authority itself was not dependent on any of those things. She recruited soldiers in a foreign country, negotiated resources and supply lines, and maintained the coherent political position that she was the legitimate queen of Egypt, and that legitimacy was a fact, not a negotiating point. This is the kind of internal stability that is genuinely rare in a 20-year-old, most of whom have not yet had to hold a position against active opposition, let alone hold an entire kingdom's worth of political identity together while camped on a border with an army she had assembled from scratch. The circumstances of her exile illuminate how the coup against her had worked. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, Pothinus, the eunuch treasurer, Achillas, the military commander, and Theodotus, the tutor, had concluded, not incorrectly, that Cleopatra was too capable to control and too popular with the Egyptian priesthood and population to marginalize through ordinary palace politics. The solution they arrived at was exile backed by military force, which was a more decisive option than a performance review. They were effective operators. They were also, it turned out, operating without an understanding of what Cleopatra was actually willing to do to get back what was hers. While she was building her army at Pelusium, events in the broader Mediterranean world were shifting in ways that would soon create an opening. Pompey, defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, was fleeing toward Egypt, seeking the protection of the Ptolemaic court. Her brother's advisors, calculating which way Roman power was pointing, made a decision about Pompey that would bring Julius Caesar to Alexandria and change everything. They did not consult Cleopatra. They would not have the chance to make that mistake twice. She was at the border with an army. She was watching the Mediterranean very carefully, and she had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. It arrived faster than anyone expected, including her. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE in pursuit of Pompey, his rival in the Roman Civil War, only to find that Pompey had already been murdered on the shore by agents of Ptolemy XIII, who had made the catastrophic miscalculation of thinking this would please Caesar. It did not. Caesar was furious, disgusted, and suddenly in possession of a military foothold in the most strategically important city in the eastern Mediterranean, with nobody obviously in charge. Cleopatra, still exiled outside Egypt, received this information and immediately understood that a window had opened. The precise story of how she got back into Alexandria, smuggled past her brother's guards, rolled into a carpet or a linen sack according to the famous ancient account, is almost too cinematic to be fully credible, and yet it is reported by the historian Plutarch and has never been convincingly disproved. Whether she was rolled in a carpet or simply smuggled in by boat under cover of darkness is almost beside the point. She got herself into a room with Julius Caesar, alone, before anyone else could intervene, and she talked. Think about the audacity of that plan for a moment. She is 21 years old. She has been in exile for nearly a year. Her brother's forces control the city between her and Caesar. There is no guaranteed outcome, no treaty waiting to be signed, no Roman promise of protection already extended. She is betting everything on a single conversation with a man she's never met, in a room she can only reach by being physically smuggled through enemy-controlled territory. The upside is the throne of Egypt. The downside is capture and execution by her brother's advisors, who had already demonstrated they were not squeamish about that kind of decision. It is the kind of bet that looks brilliant in retrospect and insane in the planning stage. She made it anyway. What happened in that first meeting is not recorded in detail. Caesar's own account of his Alexandrian campaign is notably selective about certain personal elements, which says something in itself. What we know is the outcome. Caesar did not hand her back to her brother. He did not treat her as a diplomatic problem to be managed. He engaged with her. And when Ptolemy XIII arrived the next morning to assert his own claim, he walked into a situation that had already been decided. Cleopatra had done in a single night what her brother's entire advisory apparatus had spent 2 years trying to prevent. She had positioned herself as the Roman choice. Caesar was 52, experienced, brilliant, and entirely accustomed to being the most politically sophisticated person in any given room. By all accounts, Cleopatra's arrival in that room rearranged that assumption in ways that genuinely surprised him. Ancient sources describe him as captivated, not merely physically attracted, but intellectually engaged, in the way that happens when you encounter someone who is operating at a level you recognize, because you operate there yourself. She spoke to him in Latin. She spoke to him about Egypt's politics with the depth of someone who'd been studying power since childhood. She made her case. He listened. And then he stayed in Alexandria with her for months that no military logic required. That is the most honest record we have of how the conversation went. What happened in that room, and in the weeks that followed, was one of the most consequential relationships in ancient history, and it was not primarily a love story. It was a strategic alliance built by two extraordinarily intelligent people who each had something the other desperately needed. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to reclaim her throne from her brother and his handlers. Caesar needed Egyptian resources, grain, wealth, a stable ally, to secure his position in the ongoing Roman power struggle. The mutual usefulness was obvious. That they also, by all ancient accounts, genuinely enjoyed each other's company is a bonus the historians seem almost annoyed to report. Caesar was 52, Cleopatra was 21. He was the most powerful military man in the Western world. She was, within days of their first meeting, demonstrating a grasp of politics, or of philosophy and statecraft that reportedly astonished him. The Alexandrian War, fought in the winter of 48 to 47 BCE, was Caesar's military intervention to restore Cleopatra to the throne, and it was not a clean or comfortable operation. The fighting took place within Alexandria itself. Street battles, harbour engagements, a fire that may or may not have spread to part of the library. Caesar's forces were significantly outnumbered for much of the campaign. Ptolemy, the 13th commander Achillas, had a substantial army, and the city's geography on his side. It was several months of urban warfare in which Caesar was, at various points, genuinely at risk, not the kind of confident Roman military expedition that the history books sometimes suggest. He fought it. He held. And when Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile attempting to flee after his final defeat, the war was over and Cleopatra was queen. She was also, by this point, pregnant. The timing makes the politics of their relationship impossible to disentangle from the personal. Caesar acknowledged Cesarian in no official Roman document, but he also did not deny the relationship or distance himself from Cleopatra. He stayed in Egypt. He took the Nile voyage with her. He left Roman troops behind to support her position when he finally departed. Whatever the precise nature of the arrangement was, it functioned like a genuine partnership, one in which both parties were fully aware of what they were getting from the other, and had decided that was enough, and possibly more than enough. What made the alliance unusual was not simply that it existed. Roman generals forming relationships with foreign rulers was not unprecedented, but the equality with which it operated. Caesar was used to being deferred to. Cleopatra did not defer. She argued, she challenged, she held her own ground on matters relating to Egypt with a firmness that he apparently found more interesting than annoying. A man who had spent his career surrounded by people who either competed with him aggressively or gave way entirely seems to have found the combination of genuine intellectual peer and unambiguous ally genuinely remarkable. He left Egypt eventually because Rome required him. He did not leave quietly or quickly, and he left structures in place designed to protect what he was leaving behind. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra and Caesar undertook an extended voyage up the Nile, a journey that was equal parts diplomatic tour, military demonstration, and spectacle of Egyptian royal power. The royal barge was enormous. Ancient descriptions suggest it was multiple stories tall, fitted with gardens on deck, dining rooms, shrines, and sleeping quarters of considerable comfort, a floating palace navigating the longest river in the world. This was not a casual holiday. The voyage served a very specific purpose. It announced to the towns, temples, and populations along the Nile that the Queen was back, that she had Roman backing, and that the divine order had been restored. Priests came to the riverbanks to perform ceremonies. Crowds gathered, temples were visited. The political theatre was immaculate. The barge itself was a statement before anyone on it said a word. In ancient Egypt, the Nile was not simply a river. It was the axis of the entire civilization, the source of agricultural abundance, the highway of trade and communication, the sacred waterway along which the gods themselves were believed to travel during festival processions. A royal progress up the Nile was one of the oldest and most powerful forms of political communication available to an Egyptian ruler. It was not a new idea, it was a very old idea, and Cleopatra was deploying it with the added element of a Roman general on the upper deck, visible to everyone who gathered to watch the barge pass. The towns along the Nile route, particularly those in Upper Egypt, which had been more distant from the political turbulence of Alexandria and more connected to the ancient Egyptian religious tradition, responded to the sight of their queen travelling in the correct manner, with the correct ceremonial equipment, performing the correct observances at the correct temples. She was not just a queen returning from exile, she was the goddess Isis travelling her sacred waterway. The crowds who gathered on the banks were not watching a political event, they were watching a divine one. Caesar, for his part, was seeing Egypt in a way that few Romans ever had, not as a territory to be assessed for military and economic value, though he was certainly doing that too, but as a civilization with a depth and continuity that made Rome, for all its ambitions, look relatively young. The temples they visited had been standing for 1,000 years before Rome existed. The agricultural systems they passed had been running continuously since before Greek civilization fully formed. There is reasonable historical evidence that this experience left an impression on Caesar that affected his later political thinking, his interest in calendar reform, his engagement with Egyptian religious concepts, his evident respect for Cleopatra's governance of a genuinely sophisticated state. The voyage lasted several weeks. When it ended, they returned to Alexandria, and Caesar remained for several more months before the demands of Roman politics finally pulled him away. He left with a different understanding of what Egypt was. Cleopatra stayed with a child growing, a throne secured, and the most powerful Roman of his generation having publicly travelled the length of her kingdom at her side. As demonstrations of restored legitimacy went, it was thorough. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Philopator Philometor Caesar, but he was known to history as Cesarian, Little Caesar, and his existence immediately complicated absolutely everything for absolutely everyone. Caesar never officially acknowledged him as his son, which was diplomatically convenient for a man who had a wife back in Rome, and was navigating Roman politics in which having a foreign queen's child was not an unambiguous asset. Cleopatra, on the other hand, had Cesarian depicted on temple walls across Egypt alongside herself, in the traditional poses of a royal heir, suggesting that whatever Caesar's public position was, her own was perfectly clear. The child was royal. The child was divine. The child was heir to Egypt. And if Caesar's blood ran in him, well, that was simply an additional quality. The naming was deliberate down to every syllable. Ptolemy Philopator, lover of his father, was a traditional Ptolemaic royal name, grounding the child in the dynasty's legitimate line. Philometor, lover of his mother, was equally traditional, and in Cleopatra's particular circumstances, carried an obvious weight. Caesar, appended to all of it, was the Roman element, the bridge between the Ptolemaic world and the Roman one, the claim that this child stood at the intersection of the two most powerful civilizations in the Mediterranean. It was a name designed to function as a political manifesto. He was 3 days old and already doing diplomatic work. His depiction at the Temple of Dendera, where Cleopatra had herself carved in relief presenting the infant Cesarian to the gods in the classic pose of a pharaoh offering a royal heir, is one of the most explicit surviving examples of Cleopatra's image management. The carving is enormous, formally executed, and positioned in a prominent ceremonial context. It is not a private family portrait. It is a public declaration, executed in stone, visible to every priest and pilgrim who visited the temple for the next 2,000 years. The message it delivers has not faded with the stone. This child has divine parentage, royal legitimacy, and the backing of the gods. Bring your objections to the relevant deity. The Roman political world registered Caesarian's existence with varying degrees of discomfort. Julius Caesar's own political allies and enemies were watching carefully. His great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian, the future Augustus, would have noted the boy's existence from the beginning, with the particular attention that potential rivals receive. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cesarian became not just politically inconvenient but genuinely dangerous, a child with a credible biological claim to Julius Caesar's legacy, in a world where Octavian was working very hard to establish himself as the sole legitimate heir to that legacy. Cesarian was 12 years old when he became a primary reason why Octavian wanted Egypt subdued and the Ptolemaic line ended. He was 17 when that project was completed, and Octavian's advisors resolved the awkwardness of his existence in the most direct way available to them. From 46 to 44 BCE, Cleopatra and Cesarian were in Rome, residing in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, or guests of the man who was rapidly accumulating power in the Republic and making his enemies deeply nervous. Rome had opinions about this arrangement. Specifically, it had strong, vocal, and largely negative opinions. Cicero, the orator and statesman, wrote letters expressing his displeasure with Cleopatra's presence in terms that were personal, pointed, and deeply unflattering, and Cicero was among the more restrained voices. Romans were xenophobic in the specific way that large empires often are. They had conquered much of the world and were therefore suspicious of anyone from it. An Egyptian queen who was also conspicuously intelligent, who had a Caesar's ear and possibly his heart, who was rumoured to be advising him on matters of governance, and who had the audacity to bring a child that some people quietly believed was Caesar's heir. Well, this woman was everything Rome feared and resented simultaneously. Living in Rome meant living under a specific kind of scrutiny that the palace in Alexandria, for all its dangers, had not prepared her for. In Alexandria, Cleopatra was the centre of the world. In Rome, she was a guest, technically protected, practically exposed to the full force of Roman public opinion, which expressed itself through gossip, satire, political rhetoric, and the kind of ambient social hostility that does not require a formal policy to be effective. She was watched in the markets, discussed in the forum, commented upon by men who had never met her, and felt fully qualified to assess her character, her morals, and her influence on Caesar. It was, in modern terms, like being the subject of a sustained negative media campaign conducted by some of the most talented communicators in the ancient world, and yet she stayed. For 2 years. This is not the behaviour of someone intimidated. She attended Roman social functions. She met Roman scholars, including the polymath Varro, who apparently had conversations with her about the Library of Alexandria that he considered worth recording. She observed Roman political culture with the same methodical attention she had brought to every other system she had studied. She was building a map of Rome from the inside, understanding its factions, its pressure points, its institutional structures, in the same way she had built her understanding of every other political world she'd inhabited. Caesar, in the same period, was pushing the boundaries of what a Roman leader could claim for himself. He accepted the title of Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity, a title that to Roman republicans sounded very much like king. He had a golden chair placed in the Senate. He put his own image on coins, the first living Roman ever to do so. Whether Cleopatra's presence in Rome influenced these increasingly monarchical gestures, as his enemies loudly claimed, or whether the influence ran the other way or not at all, is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the Romans who resented Caesar's drift toward one-man rule found it very convenient to point at the Egyptian queen across the Tiber as an explanation. She was visible, she was foreign, she was easy to blame, or unblaming her was easier than engaging with the actual structural problems of the late Republic. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, those problems resolved themselves in a manner that had nothing to do with her and ended everything anyway. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Roman Senate by a group of men who included some of his closest allies. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened. She was 35 years old. No, she was 25. Still a young queen. She had a small son. She had no military of her own in Rome, and the most powerful man in the Western world, her patron, her ally, and by any reasonable interpretation her partner, was dead before the afternoon was out. She left Rome quickly. There was nothing to stay for, and staying was dangerous. The conspirators who had killed Caesar were not natural friends of the Egyptian queen he had sheltered and sponsored. The city was volatile. The political situation was entirely unclear. She went home. The return to Alexandria was a return to competence on her own ground after 2 years of operating in someone else's. She stepped back into the administrative machinery of Egypt and resumed governance without apparent disruption. The reports, the grain management, the temple obligations, the currency, the trade. The country had continued running in her absence, as it was designed to do, and she slotted back into the top of it with the efficiency of someone who'd been thinking about it the entire time she was in Rome. She also had the smaller matter of her brother and co-ruler. Ptolemy XIV, whose death occurred shortly after her return. He was approximately 15 years old. The ancient sources record his death without dwelling on its causes, in the way that ancient sources sometimes do when the causes are not genuinely mysterious, but are also not the kind of thing that benefits from documentation. Cleopatra elevated Cesarian, then 3 years old, as her new co-ruler. Whatever had happened to Ptolemy XIV, the lesson was consistent with everything her family history had already established. Co-rulers with competing claims do not remain co-rulers indefinitely, and waiting for the situation to resolve itself naturally was not a strategy she had any evidence in favour of. The years between Caesar's death and her meeting with Mark Antony, roughly 3 years, are among the quietest of her reign in terms of dramatic incident, and among the most consequential in terms of consolidation. She managed Egypt through a difficult period. There were famines caused by low Nile floods, there was a plague, there was the ongoing reality of Roman civil war generating instability throughout the Mediterranean trading world that Egypt depended on. She navigated all of it. She sent money and resources to various Roman factions as seemed strategically sensible, trying to maintain relationships across a conflict whose outcome was not yet clear. She was doing what she'd always done, paying very close attention, making the best available calculation, and keeping Egypt stable and solvent through conditions that would have defeated a less competent ruler. She was waiting for the next moment. It was coming. If the meeting with Caesar had been a calculated surprise, the smuggled queen, the private audience, the immediate impression, the meeting with Mark Antony was something else entirely. It was Cleopatra this time who controlled the stage. In 41 BCE, the Roman general Mark Antony, who was by then one of the 3 men ruling the Roman world following Caesar's assassination, summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, to answer questions about her alleged support for his enemies during the recent civil war. Cleopatra did not rush to comply. She delayed. She kept him waiting. And then she arrived, not quickly, not quietly, not humbly. She arrived by barge. And the historian Plutarch's description of that barge has become one of the most quoted passages in ancient literature for good reason. It is almost impossible to read without feeling the force of what it was designed to accomplish. The gilded stern catching the afternoon light, the purple sails the colour of royalty, filling with the river wind, the silver oars dipping in time to flutes playing on deck, the smell of burning incense drifting to shore ahead of the vessel, reaching the crowd before the barge itself was fully visible, so that the first sense engaged was smell, not sight. She herself was displayed at the centre of the deck, dressed as Aphrodite. Her attendants, dressed as sea nymphs and graces, worked the ropes and the fans around her. By the time the barge arrived at the dock, the entire population of Tarsus had apparently abandoned whatever they were doing to go to the waterfront. Mark Antony was sitting in the marketplace for his official reception. He was sitting there alone. This is worth pausing on. She had been summoned to answer questions. She had turned the summons into an entrance. The man doing the summoning was now waiting in an empty marketplace while the city he was occupying had walked away from him to watch her boat arrive. As an inversion of a power dynamic, it is so complete it is almost funny. Antony sent a message inviting her to dinner. She replied that he should come to her instead. He came. In diplomatic terms, she had just made the most powerful Roman general in the Eastern Mediterranean travel to meet her on her barge, on her terms, after keeping him waiting long enough to make the point impossible to miss. The meeting that followed was by all accounts genuinely engaging for both of them. Antony was not Caesar. He was less intellectually severe, more physically exuberant, more given to laughter and display. He was also genuinely charming, in the way that large personalities who are fully at ease with themselves tend to be. Cleopatra, who had spent her 20s navigating the cool, calculating intensity of Caesar's company apparently found Antony's energy a different kind of interesting. They were both performers who understood the stage they were on. They both loved theatre, display, and the particular pleasure of doing something spectacular when something quiet would have technically been sufficient. The dinner she held for him on the barge that first night was legendary, elaborate, extravagant, perfectly executed. When he tried to match it the following evening, his version was noticeably less impressive, and he had the self-awareness to laugh about it. The alliance that would reshape the Eastern Mediterranean world began, in a sense, with her winning that dinner competition. She had been winning competitions since she was 18. This one she enjoyed rather more than most. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was, at its peak, one of the most ambitious political projects in the ancient world. They were not simply a couple. They were co-architects of an Eastern empire that, had it succeeded, might have fundamentally altered the shape of the Roman world. In 34 BCE, Antony held a ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria, a public event at which he formally distributed vast territories of the Eastern Mediterranean among Cleopatra and their children. Cesarian was named co-ruler of Egypt and Cyprus. Their twin son Alexander Helios was granted Armenia, Media, and the Parthian territories Antony intended to conquer. Their other son Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. Their daughter Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. And Cleopatra herself was named Queen of Kings. It was monumental, dazzling, and to Rome, where Octavian was already sharpening every political knife he owned, it was an act of open war. The ceremony was staged with the full theatrical force that both Cleopatra and Antony understood as a necessary dimension of political communication. The setting was the Gymnasium in Alexandria, one of the city's great public spaces. Antony and Cleopatra were seated on golden thrones raised on silver platforms. Their children sat on smaller thrones around them. The crowd assembled below looked up at a scene that was simultaneously a Roman military triumph, an Egyptian divine ceremony, and a dynastic proclamation. Nothing about the staging was accidental. Every detail, the height of the thrones, the arrangement of the children, the titles announced, had been planned to communicate a specific message to a specific audience. The audience in Rome received the message clearly. They were not pleased. The political logic behind the donations, from Cleopatra's perspective, was sound in the way that bold moves always appear sound before the consequences arrive. She'd spent her entire reign managing Egypt's relationship with Rome from a position of dependency, the junior partner in an alliance she could not afford to lose. The donations offered a different model, an Eastern empire large enough, wealthy enough, and militarily substantial enough to deal with Rome as an equal rather than a supplicant. She had Antony's legions, Egypt's wealth, and control of the Eastern Mediterranean's most important trade routes. She had children positioned as rulers of territories stretching from North Africa to the borders of Parthia. On paper, the coalition was formidable. What the donations also did, less helpfully, was hand Octavian the single most effective piece of propaganda he would ever use. He read the list of territories distributed to a foreign queen and her children, took a moment to let Rome absorb the idea of Roman-controlled lands being handed to an Egyptian woman and her half-Roman offspring, and then declared war. Not on Antony, not officially, on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant framing. It turned a Roman civil conflict into a patriotic defense of the Republic against a foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman general. The donations had transformed Cleopatra from a political ally into a public enemy, and Octavian weaponized that transformation with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this opening. She had reached for an empire. She had also handed him his war. Before a single Roman soldier set foot in Egypt, Octavian had already won a different kind of war, the war of narrative. He was extraordinarily skilled at propaganda, And he understood something that Cleopatra understood too, but from the wrong side, that the story you tell about your enemy is as powerful as any weapon. Octavian portrayed Antony as a man who'd been bewitched, unmanned, and corrupted by an Eastern sorceress. He depicted Cleopatra as a sexual predator, a foreign seductress who had lured a Roman general away from his wife, his duty, and his Roman virtue using supernatural female wiles. He did not attack her competence, her intelligence, or her political acumen, because to acknowledge those things would have required treating her as an equal. He attacked her womanhood and her foreignness. The Roman Senate formally declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a careful legal move that technically framed the coming conflict as a foreign war rather than a Roman civil war. It was a lie, but it was a useful lie, and Octavian was exceptionally good at useful lies. The Romans had a long tradition of demonizing their foreign enemies in gendered terms, the dangerous Eastern woman, alluring and treacherous, corrupting Roman virtue from the outside in. Cleopatra was not the first, but she became the definitive example, so comprehensively attached to this archetype that 2,000 years later the archetype still carries her name. The accusations levelled at her were not political analysis. They were character assassination conducted at scale, distributed through speeches, pamphlets, satirical verse, and the casual repetition of rumours that gained credibility through frequency rather than evidence. She wore the pants in the relationship the pamphlets implied. She gave orders to Antony. She was the real power. She was Egypt's queen using Egypt's queen's tools, seduction, manipulation, the dark arts of the East, to hollow out a Roman general from the inside. What made this campaign effective was not its truth, but its timing. Octavian understood that the Roman public was already anxious about the eastern direction Antony's career had taken, his adoption of foreign dress, his participation in Egyptian ceremonies, his apparent preference for Alexandria over Rome. These were things Roman audiences were primed to find troubling, and Octavian did not create the anxiety so much as organize it into a coherent political narrative with Cleopatra as the villain and Antony as the victim. The fact that Antony was a willing and intelligent participant in the Eastern project, making his own decisions about his own strategy, was not part of the story Octavian needed told. Cleopatra had her own propagandists, her own image management, her own carefully controlled narrative. But she was operating at a disadvantage that no amount of skill could fully overcome. She was telling her story to an audience in Alexandria, while Octavian was telling his story in Rome. And in the 1st century BCE, Rome was the audience whose opinion decided the outcome. The war of words preceded the war of ships by years, and when the ships finally met at Actium, the narrative had already shaped the result. History, as Octavian would demonstrate, is written most durably by the person who controls the story while the events are still happening. On the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, thus the combined naval forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony engaged the fleet of Octavian's general Agrippa at Actium, off the coast of what is now northwestern Greece. The battle was not decided by heroism or superior tactics. It was decided by attrition, by the condition of Antony's forces, by disease that had torn through their encampment over the preceding weeks, and by defections that had hollowed out their coalition from within. When Cleopatra's squadron broke through the Roman line and sailed south, whether this was a prearranged escape plan, a strategic withdrawal, or a panicked retreat is still debated by historians who have been arguing about it for 2,000 years. Antony followed her. His remaining forces, leaderless and outnumbered, surrendered or scattered. The empire they had built together, the Eastern world they had envisioned, effectively ended in an afternoon. The months leading up to Actium had been a slow deterioration that no amount of military confidence could conceal. Their fleet was larger than Agrippa's on paper, but Octavian's forces had blockaded their camp on the Greek coast through the summer, cutting off supply lines and waiting for disease and desertion to do the preliminary work. They did. By the time the battle was joined, Antony's forces were significantly weaker than the numbers suggested. Commanders and kings who had pledged their support to the Eastern Alliance were quietly reassessing their positions. The king of Amyntas of Galatia defected to Octavian before the battle was over. He would not be the last. For Cleopatra, the tactical decision at Actium, whatever it actually was, needs to be understood in the context of what she was protecting. She had 60 ships carrying the Egyptian treasury. She had 4 children, 3 of them hers and Antony's. She had an entire kingdom that had not yet fallen, that still had its administration, its grain, its fleet, and its walls. The battle at Actium was not the last possible stand for Egypt. It was one engagement in a longer situation, and retreating from a losing engagement to fight from a stronger position is not cowardice. It is strategy. Whether the strategy was correct, whether there was in fact a stronger position available, is the question that the month that followed would answer. They retreated to Alexandria. Antony, according to ancient sources, spent days in a state of devastating dejection, sitting alone at the bow of the ship staring at the water. Cleopatra, by the same ancient sources, spent those same days reorganizing. She transferred ships from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, attempting to establish an escape route eastward if the western position became untenable. She began preparations. She explored negotiations. She was not staring at the water, she was working. That was, to the end, the difference between them, not in courage, not in commitment, but in what they did when the immediate crisis arrived. One of them sat with it. The other one started planning. Back in Alexandria, following the disaster at Actium, Cleopatra did not collapse into grief and wait for the end. She negotiated. She manoeuvred. She sent emissaries to Octavian with offers, inquiries and requests, trying, with enormous intelligence and diminishing resources, to find the one arrangement that might preserve something. She attempted to protect Cesarian's future, possibly by sending him east toward India, with a large amount of treasure and a trusted advisor. She began making quiet preparations that historians have interpreted variously as planning resistance, planning escape, or planning death on her own terms. Ancient sources suggest she was experimenting with poisons during this period, testing their effects on prisoners, attempting to identify the most effective method for a death that would be fast and painless, rather than protracted and humiliating. She was, characteristically, methodical about it. Octavian was not interested in negotiating. He was interested in winning, completely, and in bringing Cleopatra to Rome as the centerpiece of his triumph. The defeated foreign queen paraded through the streets in chains, the visual proof of his victory over the East. This was the standard Roman treatment of conquered enemies. It was public, humiliating, and politically essential to the story Octavian was telling about his reign. Cleopatra understood this. She'd watched Arsinoe, her own sister, paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph years before, and she'd understood then what she understood now, that the triumph was not simply a celebration. It was a demonstration of absolute power over the person being displayed, a public assertion that the defeated party was no longer a sovereign individual, but a prop in someone else's narrative. She was not going to be that prop. Her negotiations with Octavian were therefore not negotiations in good faith. She knew he would not offer terms that preserved anything meaningful, but they served a purpose. They bought time. They kept communication open. They allowed her to continue reading his intentions, understanding his timeline, and making preparations that required a certain number of days that she would not have had if she'd simply surrendered. The ancient sources suggest she tried multiple approaches, offering treasure, offering Egypt's continued economic cooperation, appealing to Roman respect for a queen who had been an ally, even, reportedly, appealing to Octavian personally, in a meeting that he described afterward, in terms suggesting he found her impressive and also dangerous enough that he stationed men outside the door. That last detail is in its own way a compliment. You do not station guards to protect yourself from someone who is not a threat. The preparations she was making in parallel were not romantic or theatrical, they were practical. The mausoleum she had built for herself, a substantial structure into which she eventually retreated with her treasury and her two most loyal attendants, was not a dramatic stage set for a dramatic death. It was a fortified position with a locked door, a supply of valuables as potential leverage, and the only remaining means by which she could control the terms of what happened next. When the door closed behind her, she still had options. Fewer than before, but some. Cleopatra had been making something out of diminishing options since she was 18 years old. As Octavian's forces entered Egypt in the summer of 30 BCE, Antony's world dissolved. His troops defected. His navy surrendered without significant resistance, the soldiers and sailors who had followed him across the Mediterranean making the entirely rational calculation that the winning side was now clearly established, and they would prefer to be on it. He received a false report. The sources differ on how it originated, whether it was deliberate or accidental, that Cleopatra was dead. Antony, apparently undone by this news, fell on his sword. The attempt was not immediately fatal. He was carried, wounded and dying, to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself, with her treasury and 2 attendants. She refused to open the doors for fear of Roman soldiers entering with him. She and her women pulled him up through a window. He died in her arms. It is one of the stranger and more human details in this entire enormous story. The most powerful military man in the Eastern Mediterranean, pulled up through a window at the end of his life by the woman he had built a world alongside. Whatever the historians made of it later, and they made quite a lot of it, in the room itself it was simply a death, and she was there for it. Ancient sources describe her grief as genuine and physical, tearing her clothes, beating her chest, pressing her face against his wounds in the manner of ancient mourning. Whether every detail is accurate is uncertain. What the sources agree on is that she mourned him, specifically and personally, which is not nothing given that the relationship had lasted a decade and survived the loss of an empire. The death of Antony removed the last external structure around Cleopatra's position. While he had been alive, even in retreat, even in defeat, there had been a military dimension to the situation, a general with soldiers, and a history of commanding them. With him gone, there was only Cleopatra, locked in a stone building with her treasure and her 2 attendants and whatever remained of her options. Octavian's forces surrounded the mausoleum. He sent messages. He offered assurances of safety that she received with the skepticism of someone who had spent her entire adult life evaluating Roman assurances. Her grief for Antony was real, but she did not allow it to be the only thing happening. Within days of his death, she'd agreed to meet with Octavian, which required leaving the mausoleum, which required a calculated assessment of what she might gain from that meeting versus what she risked by it. She went. She sat across from the man who had spent years engineering her destruction, who had declared war on her personally, who intended to parade her through Rome as proof of his victory. She spoke to him with enough force and clarity that he stationed guards at the door and left the meeting uncertain of what she would do next. That uncertainty, created deliberately, maintained through skill in conditions of near total defeat, was the last instrument she had. She used it. Octavian came to Alexandria and he came to see her. They met at least once, possibly more. A private audience between the man who had just conquered the Mediterranean world and the woman who had spent her adult life holding Egypt together through sheer force of will and intelligence. Ancient accounts of their meeting, filtered inevitably through sources sympathetic to Octavian, suggest she was ill, dishevelled, still physically marked by her grief for Antony, and that she made a show of throwing herself at Octavian's feet before regaining composure and presenting her financial accounts with surprising precision and detail. The combination, grief and calculation, vulnerability and competence, unsettled him in ways the sources are careful not to dwell on too explicitly, but which the careful reader notices in the gaps. She had prepared for this meeting. She knew his intention was to bring her to Rome for his triumph, and she was determined to prevent that outcome by any means available to her. The meeting was therefore a performance of a specific kind. She needed to convince him that she had accepted her situation, that she was cooperative, that she intended to live and to go to Rome willingly. This was the one thing that might relax the surveillance around her, enough to allow her to act on her own terms. She presented her treasury accounts, argued with her own treasurer when he suggested she had hidden assets, appeared distressed at the accusation, appeared credible in her denials. She was, in the language of modern assessment, playing a long game in a very short time window, and she was playing it in front of someone who was also extraordinarily intelligent and had spent years studying her from a distance, where Octavian left the meeting having decided she was subdued and manageable. He assigned guards. He gave instructions that she was to be kept comfortable and alive. She was too valuable to his triumph to lose. He was 23 years old, victorious, and supremely confident in his ability to read a situation. He had just sat across from Cleopatra of Egypt for the first and only time in his life, and he had reached his conclusion. He was wrong. Not entirely wrong. She was in a desperate position with very few options remaining. But in the one critical question, what she would do when those options finally ran out, his assessment was incorrect, and he would not have the opportunity to correct it. She had learned what she needed from the meeting, the shape of the surveillance around her, the timing of his plans, the degree of confidence that would translate into the degree of inattention that she required. She returned to the mausoleum. She sent a letter to Octavian. She made her preparations. She dressed in her royal robes and her jewellery, the full presentation of the goddess queen she had been for 21 years. She had one piece of intelligence she'd gathered carefully and acted on precisely. Octavian's triumph was scheduled. She intended to ensure she was not in it. She would not be. On the 12th of August, 30 BCE, Cleopatra VII Philopater, last pharaoh of Egypt, died in her mausoleum in Alexandria. She was 39 years old. She had ruled for nearly 21 years. The official story, recorded by Plutarch, is the asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled in with a basket of figs, applied to her arm or her breast while she sat dressed in her royal robes, already adorned as Isis for the last time. Her two attendants, Eros and Charmian, died with her. Octavian's men broke down the doors and found them all. Charmian, reportedly still alive but barely, was asked by a Roman soldier if this was well done. She answered that it was, and that it was fitting for someone descended from so many kings, and then she died too. Whether the asp is literally true remains an open question. The cobra is certainly capable of causing death quickly and relatively painlessly, which matches the account. But ancient and modern toxicologists have also pointed out that smuggling a live cobra in a basket of figs is both logistically complicated and somewhat unpredictable as a method. Cobras being cobras, is they do not always cooperate with the intended choreography. Some historians argue for a concealed poison vial, perhaps hemlock or a compound of opium, which would produce similar symptoms and would have been entirely available to someone who had spent recent weeks researching exactly this question. Others suggest a combination of venom and poison, the asp used symbolically for its religious resonance. The uraeus, the royal cobra of the pharaohs, was the symbol of divine kingship in Egyptian tradition, while the actual lethal mechanism was more controlled. The specific method matters less than the fact of the decision. Cleopatra chose the timing, the setting, the dress, and the company. She was in her robes, she was in her mausoleum. Her attendants died with her, which means they were aware and willing, which means there was a conversation and a preparation. This was not a panicked impulse. It was a final exercise of the one authority that had never been taken from her, the authority over herself. Octavian had conquered her kingdom, killed her son, removed every external structure of her power. He had not been able to touch this. She had made sure of it. The Roman soldiers who found her reported that her body showed no obvious signs of distress or struggle. She appeared, by their accounts, simply to be sleeping. Octavian, told of her death, was reportedly angry. The centerpiece of his triumph had denied him his moment. He had her buried with full honours beside Mark Antony, as she had requested. The tomb was elaborate. It did not survive into the modern era, and its location has been lost. She is somewhere under the soil of Alexandria, and she has not yet been found. That too feels somehow appropriate. The day after Cleopatra died, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. Octavian did not appoint another pharaoh or support another Ptolemaic ruler. He absorbed Egypt directly into the Roman system, but with a significant distinction. Egypt was not made a standard Roman province. It was made effectively Octavian's personal property. He sent a governor, a prefect, to administer it, and gave strict orders that no Roman senator was even permitted to enter Egypt without his explicit personal permission. He understood what Cleopatra had understood about Egypt. It was uniquely, extravagantly valuable. The grain, the wealth, the Nile, the trade routes, it was the engine of the ancient economy, and whoever controlled it controlled the power balance of the Mediterranean world. Octavian took that engine home with him. Cesarian was found and killed. He was 17 years old, and his death was a deliberate decision. Octavian's advisor Arius reportedly counselled that too many Caesars were problematic, a line that has the studied casualness of someone who has already decided and is simply providing a rationale. The boy had done nothing except exist, which was the problem. His existence was the biological argument against Octavian's claim to Julius Caesar's legacy, and Octavian had not fought a decade of civil war to leave that argument alive. Cesarian died, and with him the last direct connection between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Julian one. Cleopatra's 3 children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Antony's Roman wife Octavia, in one of history's more pointed domestic arrangements. Octavia, whose marriage to Antony Cleopatra had effectively displaced, raised his children by Cleopatra with apparent grace and genuine care. Cleopatra Selene, the twins' surviving sister, was eventually married to the king of Mauritania in what was now northwestern Africa, and became a queen herself, educated and sophisticated, who named her son Ptolemy, and who, by some accounts, had Alexandria's famous lighthouse replicated in her new capital city. She carried something of her mother forward into a different corner of the world, which is perhaps the most that was available to her. The Egypt that emerged after Cleopatra's death was wealthy, productive, and efficiently administered, as it had been under her. The difference was entirely at the top. Where there had been a queen who spoke Egyptian, who dressed as Isis, who had walked the temples and addressed the priests in their own language, there was now a Roman prefect managing the grain harvest for Rome's benefit. The temples continued to function. The Nile continued to flood. The farmers continued to plant and harvest. The extraordinary civilization that had built the pyramids and the library and the lighthouse continued its operations, largely unchanged at the level of daily life. At the top it was a different world entirely, and at the top it would never again belong to anyone who had chosen, deliberately and with effort, to make it their own. Almost immediately after her death, the process of mythologizing and distorting Cleopatra began, and it has not really stopped since. The Romans who wrote most of the early accounts had every reason to portray her as a dangerous, irrational seductress rather than an intelligent stateswoman, because the alternative framing, that two of their greatest generals had formed genuine political alliances with her as an equal, reflected badly on Rome in ways the Romans preferred not to examine. So the seductress myth took hold. It became the dominant narrative for roughly 2,000 years, amplified by Shakespeare's play, by countless paintings, by Victorian engravings that imagined her as a languid femme fatale draped across furniture, and eventually by Hollywood, which added the additional embellishment that she looked like Elizabeth Taylor, which she almost certainly did not. Ancient coins bearing her portrait, the most reliable contemporary images we have, show a strong, distinctive face with a prominent nose and a determined jaw. She's shown in profile, as rulers were, with the Greek-style diadem of a Ptolemaic queen. There is nothing languid about her face. There is a great deal that reads, even in metal, as alert. The ancient sources themselves, even the hostile ones, describe her power as residing primarily in her voice and her conversation rather than in physical beauty in the conventional sense. Plutarch, writing well after her death, notes explicitly that she was not remarkable in appearance, but that the effect of her company, the sound of her voice, the quality of her engagement, the sheer breadth of what she could discuss and how she discussed it, was something people found impossible to ignore. She was captivating. She was not captivating in the way that the paintings and the films suggest. She was captivating in the way that a genuinely exceptional mind, in full possession of itself, tends to be. The seductress narrative served a specific political purpose and was maintained by subsequent generations for reasons that were less deliberate but equally structural. Women who wielded power in the ancient world were routinely explained through their sexuality rather than their capability, because acknowledging their capability required acknowledging that capability was possible, that a woman could run a state, conduct foreign policy, manage an economy, lead a military response, and that acknowledgement was inconvenient for systems organized around the assumption that she could not. Cleopatra was a particularly urgent case because she had done all of those things demonstrably, in public, in a well-documented period of history, and had done them well enough that the most powerful men of her era had chosen to ally with her. Explaining that through seduction was easier than explaining it through competence, and easier explanations tend to survive longer. What we are left with, 2,000 years later, is a figure who is among the most famous in recorded history and among the most thoroughly misrepresented. She was not primarily a lover. She was primarily a ruler. She was not primarily beautiful. She was primarily brilliant. She was not brought down by passion. She was brought down by a military force that outnumbered and outresourced her, after she'd maintained an independent kingdom against Roman pressure for 21 years with a skill that her conqueror was careful never to fully acknowledge. She was, in the end, someone history has been trying to diminish for a very long time with limited success. She keeps coming back. That too feels like her. What Cleopatra left behind is larger than her own biography. She ruled Egypt for 21 years during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history, maintaining the country's independence and economic vitality through a combination of diplomacy, intelligence, and ruthless political calculation. She was the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt. After her, the pharaonic tradition that had run for 3,000 years was over. She was a linguist, a scholar, and a practitioner of statecraft whose methods were studied and written about, even in the ancient world. She wrote, or was attributed with writings on, medicine, cosmetics, alchemy, and gynecology, derived texts that circulated in the ancient world even after her death, valued on their own terms by readers who were not interested in the author's political story. She built temples. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, on whose walls her image appears alongside Cesarian, is still standing. She maintained the religious infrastructure of Egypt with a consistency and personal engagement that earned her the genuine loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood, not the performed loyalty that political convenience generates, but the kind of loyalty that comes from someone repeatedly demonstrating that they take your world seriously. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to do that, and the Egyptian people knew it, and they remembered it in ways that outlasted her reign. Her daughter Cleopatra Selene became Queen of Mauritania, in what is now Morocco and Algeria, and ruled with sophistication and ambition. Ancient coins from her reign show her portrait, distinctive, strong-featured, recognizable. She named her son Ptolemy, and he ruled after her, carrying the dynasty's name into a new geography, a new century, a new world that his grandmother had never seen, but that his grandmother's intelligence had made possible by ensuring his mother survived the catastrophe of 30 BCE. That survival was not accidental. It was arranged in the final negotiations by someone who was still managing outcomes even while her own situation was irretrievably lost. The asp, if it was an asp, was the Egyptian cobra, the uraeus, the royal symbol that had crowned pharaohs for 3,000 years before her. If she chose it deliberately, the symbolism was exact and intentional. She died as she had lived, in full costume, in full identity, on her own terms, as the last in a line that stretched back to the earliest human attempts to build a civilization along a river in a desert. She was not the end of Egypt. She was the last person who was fully, entirely, and without apology Egypt's own. Everything that came after was something else, administered by someone else, for someone else's benefit. She was 39 years old. She had been doing this since she was 18, and when they opened the door and found her, she was still dressed as the goddess. Of course she was. She had always understood that the last impression was as important as the first, and she had been managing impressions since before most of the people in that room were born. Let's talk about what Cleopatra actually wore, because it was not an accident and it was not simply fashion. Every garment she put on was a calculated decision about which version of herself she was presenting to which audience on which day, and the range of those versions was considerably wider than most queens of any era have ever managed. On formal Egyptian ceremonial occasions, she wore the robes of Isis, white linen pleated in the ancient style, the characteristic knot at the breast, the headdress with the sun disk and cow horns, presenting herself as the goddess incarnate to an audience that believed that completely and needed to see it confirmed in fabric and gold. On diplomatic occasions with Greek-speaking courtiers and foreign ambassadors, she appeared in the Hellenistic style, draped silk, jewelled diadems, the visual vocabulary of a Macedonian queen in the tradition her dynasty had maintained for 3 centuries. For Roman visitors, she could shift again. The wardrobe was a linguistic system, and she was fluent in all of it. The fabrics themselves were extraordinary by any standard the ancient world could offer. Egyptian linen, woven so finely that the Greeks called it woven air, was the foundation of the royal wardrobe. The quality available to a Ptolemaic queen was not the functional linen of ordinary Egyptian life. It was fabric so fine it was essentially transparent, layered and pleated into garments of remarkable complexity. Ancient tomb paintings give some sense of what the finest Egyptian linen looked like in motion, the way it moved with the body, the way it caught light differently at different angles, the way the pleats held their shape through the day. Achieving that pleating required skilled specialists who spent hours working with starch and narrow tools before a single garment was worn. Silk arrived in Egypt through the eastern trade routes, expensive, exotic, and immediately absorbed into the royal wardrobe as a marker of access to the farthest reaches of the known world's commerce. Purple dye, extracted from sea snails along the Phoenician coast at extraordinary labour and cost, was the colour of kings and queens across the Mediterranean, and it appeared in Cleopatra's wardrobe in the deep Tyrian shade that was the most expensive colour available to the ancient world. A single garment dyed in full Tyrian purple represented a cost that most people in the 1st century BCE would not accumulate in a lifetime. She wore it because she could, and because the people who saw it knew exactly what it meant. The jewellery was its own category of statement. Ancient sources and depictions of Cleopatra show her in elaborate gold and gemstone pieces, earrings, necklaces, armbands, rings, drawn from Egypt's considerable gold-working tradition and supplemented by gems from across the trade network, pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Egypt's eastern desert mines, some of the finest emerald deposits in the ancient world, carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise. The treasury of the Ptolemaic dynasty had been accumulating luxury goods for 3 centuries, and Cleopatra had access to all of it. She did not wear it indiscriminately. Specific pieces for specific occasions, specific audiences, specific messages. The famous story of her dissolving a pearl earring in vinegar and drinking it to win a bet with Antony about who could host the more extravagant dinner is almost certainly legend. But the pearl was real. The pearl, in the 1st century BCE, was worth a fortune, and she knew exactly what dissolving it in front of a Roman general communicated about Egypt's wealth relative to Rome's expectations of it. The wardrobe was never just clothing, it was argument. One of the most revealing things about any ancient ruler is not what they said about themselves, but what they put on their coins, because coins were the mass media of the ancient world. They travelled everywhere trade went. They changed hands millions of times. They were seen by people who would never visit a palace or attend a ceremony or hear a speech. And the image on a coin was often the only representation of a ruler those people would ever encounter. Cleopatra understood this. She managed her coinage with the same attention she brought to every other instrument of political communication, and the decisions she made about what went on her coins tell you a great deal about how she thought about her own authority and her own image in ways that her surviving portraits do not. The Ptolemaic coinage tradition she inherited depicted rulers in the Greek style, idealized, classical, the face softened toward an aesthetic standard rather than presented as a specific individual. Cleopatra departed from this. Her coins show a face that ancient historians and modern numismatists have generally agreed is meant to be recognizable. A strong profile, prominent nose, defined jaw. The diadem of a Ptolemaic queen. This is not idealized. This is, as best as we can tell, her, or at least her version of her, the version she chose to authorize, which is its own kind of statement. She was not presenting a generic queen. She was presenting Cleopatra specifically as a face people should know and recognize and associate with the authority her coins represented. The inscriptions on her coins were equally deliberate. She was Cleopatra, Queen Theophilopator, goddess who loves her father. The divine title was standard for Ptolemaic rulers, but carried particular weight in her case because she meant it to be taken literally, not ceremonially. The reverse sides of her coins varied by period and audience. Some showed Ptolemaic eagles, some showed divine symbols associated with Isis, some, none in the period of her alliance with Antony, showed his portrait alongside hers. Those joint coins are historically remarkable. A Roman general and an Egyptian queen side by side on currency, each with their titles presented as co-equal powers. Octavian's propagandists used them as evidence of Antony's corruption. They were, from Cleopatra's perspective, an accurate representation of a genuine partnership between two sovereign powers. The framing depended entirely on whose story you were reading. What her coins also tell us, incidentally, is something about the gap between ancient and modern standards of royal portraiture. Her face as depicted is, by the conventions of Hollywood and romantic tradition, not what anyone expected. The nose is substantial, the expression is not soft. She looks like someone who is thinking about something, and would prefer you had something useful to contribute to the conversation. This is not the face of someone waiting to be admired. It is the face of someone in charge, minted in bronze and silver, and distributed across a kingdom as a reminder of exactly who was running things. That is precisely what a coin is for. She knew it, and she used it accordingly. Ancient accounts of Cleopatra's banquets read like dispatches, from a world where the concept of moderation had simply never been proposed. Floors strewn with rose petals to a depth of several inches, tables spread with gold plate, walls hung with purple and cloth of gold, lighting from thousands of lamps arranged in geometric patterns across the ceilings. The smells alone, the incense, the flowers, the elaborate food, the wine mixed with spices from the Eastern trade, would have hit you at the door with the force of something between a religious experience and a very expensive headache. This was not hospitality. This was demonstration. The banquets of the Alexandrian court were performances of Egyptian wealth and royal power staged for an audience that was expected to go home and report what they had seen, which they always did, because nobody who attended a dinner at Cleopatra's court managed to stop talking about it. The food at these events was a catalogue of everything the Mediterranean and Eastern trade networks could deliver to a royal kitchen. Dishes prepared with spices from India and Arabia, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, that cost more per gram than most people in the ancient world earned in a week. Game birds roasted in honey and herbs, and fish prepared in sauces whose recipes took years to develop and were treated as proprietary information by the royal kitchens. Elaborate sweet preparations made with honey, sesame, and imported sugar being in this period an extraordinary luxury rather than a pantry staple. The wine was exceptional, chosen from the best available Egyptian, Greek, and Syrian vintages, served in gold cups that were, according to some accounts, gifted to guests at the end of the evening. Just in case the message had not been sufficiently clear, entertainment ran alongside the food. Musicians, dancers, acrobats, and theatrical performers were integrated into the evening in the Egyptian tradition of banquet entertainment that stretched back thousands of years. Poetry was recited, philosophical questions were posed and debated. Cleopatra herself participated in these conversations. She was, by all accounts, a brilliant conversationalist who could move between topics with the ease of someone for whom the library visit was not a metaphor but a daily habit. The evenings were long. They were designed to be. You did not attend a dinner at the Alexandrian court and leave early. The political function of all this was direct and conscious. Every important visitor to Alexandria was entertained at the palace, and the scale and quality of the entertainment communicated Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's power more viscerally than any speech or document could have done. You sat at her table, ate her food, drank her wine from her gold cups, listened to her musicians, and participated in her conversations, and by the time the evening was over, you had experienced Egypt's power rather than simply been told about it. That experience, embodied, sensory, impossible to fully convey to someone who had not been there, was worth more than a treaty. It was the ancient world's most effective sales pitch, and she ran it every time someone worth impressing arrived in Alexandria. Cleopatra ran one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the ancient Mediterranean world, and almost none of the histories give her full credit for it. The visible parts of her political career, The meetings with Caesar and Antony, the public ceremonies, the military campaigns were supported by a continuous, invisible infrastructure of correspondence, informants, couriers, and diplomatic relationships that kept her informed about events across the known world with a speed and reliability that was, for its time, remarkable. She knew what was happening in Rome before most Romans knew what was happening in Rome. She knew the state of Octavian's fleet before Actium. She knew which Eastern kings were wavering in their allegiance to the coalition. She knew because she had invested systematically and over many years in the systems that delivered that knowledge to her. The mechanics of ancient correspondence were formidable. Messages travelled by ship across the Mediterranean, faster than any land route for most destinations, but subject to weather, season, and the considerable difficulty of finding reliable passage. A message from Rome to Alexandria in favourable conditions might arrive in a week. In unfavourable conditions, it might take a month or not arrive at all. The information it contained was already days or weeks old when it was sent, and older still when it was read. Operating on this information required the ability to reason forward from incomplete and delayed data, to understand not just what had happened, but what was likely to happen next, given the patterns established by everything that had come before. This is a specific analytical skill, and Cleopatra had it. Her correspondence included Roman politicians of multiple factions. She maintained relationships across the Roman political spectrum rather than committing exclusively to any single alliance, which gave her information even from the side that was not currently her primary partner. She had diplomatic relationships with the kingdoms of Judea, Nabatea, Cyprus, and multiple eastern territories, some each of which provided windows into regional events and the movements of the Roman power structures that overlapped them all. She had, by ancient accounts, people in Rome who reported to her, the ancient equivalent of a foreign intelligence service, operating through the informal channels of trade, diplomacy, and personal connection rather than through any formal institutional structure. The letters she sent were as carefully managed as the ones she received. What she chose to reveal, what she chose to ask, what she acknowledged knowing, and what she pretended not to know, all of it was calculated. Caesar's letters to her, of which fragments of references survive in other sources, suggest a correspondence of genuine intellectual engagement rather than simple diplomatic exchange. Antony's letters to her, described in ancient sources, were reportedly affectionate to the point of embarrassment, letters written in a style that his Roman contemporaries found undignified in a general. She wrote back, "What she wrote is lost. The fact that he wrote the way he did tells you something about how she had written to him. She knew how to write a letter the way she knew how to arrange a banquet. Every word was chosen. Every word was working. Cleopatra had 4 children, and each of them was born into a situation that would have been incomprehensible to any normal child and was, for these particular children, simply the world they grew up in. Cesarian, the eldest, born in 47 BCE, grew up knowing he was the son of a Roman dictator who had been assassinated before the boy could walk, and the co-ruler of Egypt from the age of 3. The twins, or Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were born in 40 BCE, children of the most powerful Roman general in the eastern Mediterranean and the Queen of Egypt, given names at their public presentation ceremony that indicated they were being positioned as rulers of a world that had not yet been fully conquered. Ptolemy Philadelphus arrived in 36 BCE, the youngest, given the name of one of the Ptolemaic dynasty's most celebrated rulers, as if history itself were being conscripted as credential. Their education would have followed the model Cleopatra herself had experienced, intensified by the political stakes attached to each of them. Languages were primary, Greek as the court and scholarly tongue, Egyptian as the language of the kingdom they were expected to rule, Latin as the language of the power that dominated the world they were being prepared for. Tutors of the quality available in Alexandria, which was to say, the best quality available anywhere in the ancient world, were responsible for mathematics, rhetoric, philosophy, and the physical education that was expected of rulers. Cesarian, as the designated heir, would have received the most comprehensive and politically focused preparation, studying not just academic subjects but the administrative structures of the kingdom he was to inherit. What is harder to recover, and more interesting to consider, is what it actually felt like to be a child in that household. The palace was a place of extraordinary sensory richness. The incense, the music, the ceremony, the constant movement of people from across the known world. It was also a place of permanent political tension, staffed by people whose loyalties were complex and whose behaviour was always partly performance. Their mother was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most impressive and also most pressured people alive. She was warm with her children, ancient sources suggest genuine maternal affection, and her negotiations in the final period of her life included determined efforts to secure her children's safety. But she was also almost always working, almost always in the middle of something that required her full attention. The twins and Ptolemy Philadelphus ended up in Rome, raised by Octavia with what appears to have been genuine care. Cleopatra VII, the daughter who survived longest and most visibly, became Queen of Mauritania, and by all accounts ruled intelligently and with cultural sophistication. She commissioned art, built monuments, maintained the intellectual traditions she had been raised in. She had been born to two of the most powerful people in the ancient world, lost both of them before she was 12, been paraded through Rome in a triumph as a conquered child, and then become a queen. The resilience required for that trajectory is not accidental. It was built deliberately and with great effort in a palace in Alexandria by a mother who understood better than anyone what her children were going to need to survive. Let's take a moment, a quiet one, to understand the full weight of what ended when Cleopatra died. Not just her reign, not just her personal story, but something much older and much larger. The pharaonic tradition itself, the unbroken thread of Egyptian royal culture that stretched back more than 3,000 years from the moment Octavian's soldiers broke down that door. 3,000 years. To put that in terms that make contact with the scale of it, when the first pharaoh unified Egypt and established the royal tradition that Cleopatra was the last to hold, the civilization that would become Greece was not yet recognizable as such. Rome did not exist. The city of Troy, whose destruction the Greeks would later treat as the organizing event of their heroic mythology, had not yet been built. 3,000 years of one continuous tradition, one unbroken line of pharaohs, one culture whose agricultural, religious, architectural, and administrative systems had accumulated and refined themselves across a span of time that made every other civilization in the Mediterranean world look provisional. Cleopatra was the last person to stand at the top of that tradition in a way that was genuine rather than ceremonial. She had learned its languages, performed its rituals, spoken to its priests in their own words, and governed its people with the knowledge that she was not administering a territory, but continuing a civilization. Every pharaoh before her had understood themselves as the link between the human world and the divine order that kept the Nile flooding, the crops growing, and the sun rising. Cleopatra understood this too, and she acted on it with a thoroughness that her predecessors had not bothered with. She was the last one. She knew, by the end, that she was the last one. What that knowledge felt like, standing in the robes of Isis in a mausoleum in Alexandria, with Octavian's forces outside the door, is not something any source records directly. But the preparation she made for her death suggests she understood the ceremonial weight of the moment as well as the personal one. She dressed in her full royal regalia. She presented herself as the goddess. She arranged to be buried with Antony, as she had requested, in a tomb prepared in advance. She died, as she had always tried to live, in the correct form, performing the role to the final moment, because the role was not separate from who she was. It had never been. She had chosen it, mastered it, inhabited it so completely that the woman and the goddess and the queen were not three things. They were one thing, and they died together. What came after was efficient, well administered, and entirely Roman. The grain still moved, the Nile still flooded, the temples still stood and were eventually used for different purposes. Alexandria remained a great city. The library endured for centuries before its final decline. But the animating principle, the idea that there was a person at the centre of it all who was also, in some real and meaningful sense, the civilization's own, who had chosen it and been shaped by it and given her life to it, that was gone. Octavian was excellent at governance. He was not Egypt's. She had been. And in the long, strange accounting of history, that difference matters more than any of the battles. And so tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your climate-controlled room, with no siblings plotting to remove you from your own house, and no Roman general camped outside your door demanding a triumphal parade, take a moment to think about her. Think about a woman who picked up 9 languages the way most of us pick up bad habits, deliberately, obsessively, and with a specific purpose in mind, who ran one of the most complex economies in the ancient world from a palace that smelled of kiak and myrrh, while simultaneously being a goddess, a mother, a scholar, and the last line of defense between her civilization and the most powerful empire on earth, who was exiled at 20 and had rebuilt her position by 21, who dressed as Aphrodite on a gilded barge and made the most powerful Roman general in the Eastern Mediterranean sit alone in an empty marketplace waiting for her, who managed grain reports and diplomatic correspondence and poison research and the raising of 4 children and the maintenance of 3,000 years of royal tradition, all at the same time, all with the same focused attention, none of it delegated to someone else if she could help it. She did not get to grow old. She did not get to see what Cleopatra VII built in Mauritania, or what her daughter named her son, or whether the lighthouse she grew up looking at from the palace window stood long after her. She died at 39 in a stone room she had locked herself into, in the robes she had chosen for the occasion, on her own terms, the last term she had left. That is not a small thing. In the circumstances she was in, controlling the terms of anything at all required everything she had. History has not always been kind to her in the telling. 2,000 years of poets, painters, playwrights, and filmmakers have returned again and again to the snake, the pearls, the eyeliner, the drama, and missed, almost entirely, the woman who was doing 12 things at once behind all of it. The woman who learned Egyptian because she thought the people who spoke it deserved to be spoken to, who understood that a coin was a conversation, and a barge was an argument, and a banquet was a foreign policy tool, who read everything, remembered everything, and used everything, until the moment she had nothing left to use. She was not perfect. She made the decisions that her world required, and some of them were cold, and some of them were wrong, and the dynasty she was trying to save did not survive her. But she survived, on her own terms, for 21 years in conditions that would have ended most reigns in 5. She kept Egypt fed. She kept Egypt independent. She kept going, and going, and going through exile and civil war, and the death of allies, and the grinding pressure of an empire that had decided her kingdom was too valuable to leave in her hands, until the very last moment when she made one final decision and carried it out with the same precision she had brought to everything else. So tonight, as you close your eyes in your warm and unremarkable safety, Maybe spare a quiet thought for the woman who bathed in donkey milk and ran a continent and read philosophy before breakfast and still had to deal with her brother trying to have her killed. Who wore the robes of a goddess because she had decided, years before anyone else believed it, that she was exactly what those robes said she was. She was the last pharaoh. She was the last of 3,000 years, and she went out dressed for the role, which is, when you think about it, the most Cleopatra thing she ever did. Sleep well. You have running water, a functioning democracy, and nobody's currently smuggling you across a border and a carpet. You're doing extraordinarily well. Good night.